Welcome to the next overview for Microeconomic Principles here at Rutgers University Camden, and I am Professor Guy Pascal. And here I'm just going to go over some of the material and just give you a brief overview of what we're going to be reviewing for this particular week. First off, we're going to be going over Chapter 3, which is entitled Demand, Supply, and Equilibrium. It's a couple of initial things you should understand. The textbook distinguishes between households and firms. Make sure you understand the difference between these two. This is very important moving forward. Also be able to distinguish between products and output and factor in input markets. It's very important to understand these differences. The main importance of this chapter is going to be understanding demand, supply, and the actual equilibrium. So make sure that you can distinguish between a demand schedule and a demand curve. The same thing holds for supply schedule and supply curve. The way I always explain this to my students is that if you look at a demand schedule, you'll have a table of information that lists out the prices of a commodity and the quantities demanded at those prices. So you'll see a table that will say, for example, at $1, one item is demanded. At $2, 0 items are demanded. So if you see a table of information like that, that is a demand schedule. I always like to think of it as the data behind the demand curve or the supply curve. So make sure you're comfortable with those particular items. And if you actually see a graph, that is the actual curve itself. So think of a demand curve as the graphical representation of the demand schedule. The same thing holding for the supply curve and the supply schedule. Understand the law of demand and the law of supply. Each of those state is that the law of demand states that there tends to be an inverse relationship between price and quantity demanded, while the supply curve states that there's a tendency to be a positive relationship between price and quantity supplied. Also, understand the difference between individual demand and market demand. Realize that market demand is just a summation of individual demand. So if we look at a particular marketplace and that marketplace has 10,000 people in it, the market demand for that particular marketplace is just the horizontal summation of those 10,000 individuals, and adding those individual demand curves gets us the market demand curve. A very important part of this chapter, and this is a part that people and students oftentimes get confused about, is the difference between change in demand and change in quantity demanded, and the difference between change in supply versus the change in quantity supplied. When you hear change in supply or change in demand, realize that that means that the demand or the supply curve is physically going to shift its location. It's going to shift to the right or to the left. So a change in demand or a change in supply means that the supply or demand curve is physically going to change its location. Change in quantity demanded or change in quantity supplied means that you're staying on a pre-existing supply or demand curve. You're just physically moving to a different location on that pre-existing demand curve. Also, very important is the notion of an equilibrium. What an economist means by an equilibrium, and also have an understanding of how market forces have a tendency to move markets towards equilibrium. Additionally, we're going to be going over a shortage and a surplus. Make sure you understand those by definition and what they look like graphically, and how changing the determinants of supply and demand impact equilibrium. So, for example, when one of the determinants of demand or supply changes, we will move from one equilibrium price and quantity to another equilibrium price and quantity. So make sure you're comfortable with what the determinants of demand and supply are. So if one of those change, you know whether it impacts demand or supply, but also know the direction that the shift occurs, and then be able to figure out what the new equilibrium price and quantity is. From there, we move to demand and supply applications. Here, it's more, as it says, obviously more applied, looking at how to use demand and supply to analyze what goes on in markets. In particular, make sure you understand how the market system allocates resources and the different or the alternate rationing mechanisms that are out there. So realize that the market system, price is the rationing mechanism. There are certain things that I would like to purchase, certain types of cars, nicer houses, etc. I don't purchase them because the price is too high relative to my income. I can't afford to purchase those particular items. So understand how price is a rationing mechanism, and then understand that if a government gets involved in a marketplace and starts regulating the price, what are other types of rationing mechanisms that are used in order to distribute the goods that are under price controls. Explain what a price floor and a price ceiling are, and the mechanism, exactly how that works. So what are the implications if a price floor is put in place? What is a price floor by definition? And what is the implication on the marketplace? Also for a price ceiling. You should be able to also understand the analysis, the supply and demand analysis that describes the impact of a tariff. This is important. This is a very important application of supply and demand analysis. So it's a good idea to understand it. Also understand consumer surplus, producer surplus, and total surplus, what their definitions are, and in particular, how economists use these measures to measure the efficiency of a market, or in particular, how, if a policy is put in place, to determine, quote unquote, the winners and the losers, who benefits, who loses, using consumer, producer, and total surplus, and deadweight loss. Deadweight loss is just consumer or producer surplus that ends up being destroyed when a policy is put in place. So make sure you understand what the concept of deadweight loss is and how it is actually measured.